Right. I'm just going to start out with a few slides just to set the stage for what we're going to look at in a moment, where I'll actually show the tool in a live demo. We call the tool migFx. It stands for Migration Framework. And this has been around for quite a few years. So it's not a new thing. It's not vaporware. You know, this is a real system that is working on a daily basis in real life data migrations. So that being said, the first slide I have here is focused on a core concept that is very fundamental to the way that our migration tool works. And it makes it a little bit different from other more other solutions that you see that are more ETL based than our tool is. Here we're looking at some data, some sets of data in some kind of data model structure. It's not so important. There's quite a few boxes, there's quite a few data sets here, but they tend always to be organized into domains or networks that are more related to each other than they're related to other stuff. And in this sample here, we got the green stuff is related, is a customer and related stuff to the customer, whereas the red stuff is account related and the blue stuff is portfolio related. And of course, they also have interrelationships that a customer owns an account is tied to a portfolio and so on. But they do naturally group themselves into domains or networks, you can call it. Now, we have a different way of looking at this. We see the exact same data sets, but we look at them as hierarchies. And the green stuff is the customer, and it's a hierarchy because you do have one entity that if you grab hold of a customer, you can actually get all related stuff to that customer out connected to it. So when we migrate a customer, we do not just migrate the owning row in the customer table. We migrate the customer and all connected data to that one customer. The same for the account and the same for the portfolio. And the red lines here represent that, of course, these hierarchies also have relationships between them, as I said before. Now, this is what we migrate. These are the units we migrate. So we migrate one account as a complete unit with all its dependencies, and then we migrate the next account with its dependencies. And these units of migration, that's what we call business objects. And this notion, this concept of business objects is completely fundamental to how our tool works. So having said that, another important aspect of our tool is that we have a very clear separation here. So you have, of course, we're migrating from a source system to a target system. But we build a target map that is solely concerned with the target system. It does not have any knowledge whatsoever of the source system. So we build a target map that knows what the expectations are in the target system, namely what data do we need to produce. And the target map then exposes an interface. And that's a way of telling, if you give me these data, I can sort the rest of it out. That means that I can derive and calculate and produce the values for the data sets in the target system if you give me the data that corresponds to this interface that I expose. So it will produce the data, and almost more importantly, it will introduce a big amount of validation to ensure that the data that flows into the target system can do so without any errors at the point of insertion and the point of delivery. So this is, as I said, solely related to the target system. The target map does not in any way need to know anything about where does the data come from at the start of the day. Which source system is irrelevant for the target map. On top of that, we then produce a source map, and the source map knows the interface of the target map, and then the task of the source map is to figure out how do we get from the data in the source system to something that conforms to the interface and can flow into the target map. So two completely different entities here. And this interface, that is our business objects. That is these hierarchies. So if we look at a sample here, like the account from before, a business object on this interface is simply a description of the nodes in the hierarchy, and for each node, what set of fields do we need to receive for this node. That's all in this interface. It's very lean. There's no functionality whatsoever. It's simply just a description of these hierarchies. With this separation, we get into a world that if you are migrating into the same target system multiple times, I don't know if you're working in the ERP space, for instance, but if you're migrating into SAP or you're migrating into Microsoft Dynamics, you might be migrating into the same target system over and over again. So you have one target map, and then you have a source map per project. So you have a source map for each source system that you might be migrating from, or each actually situation you might be migrating from. Of course, if you find yourself that you're often migrating from the same source system into the same target map, then you can get some reuse out of the source map as well. But with this separation, you get a very high degree of reuse of your target map that will grow in quality over time from project to project. Built on the business objects at the center, our application or our tool set or framework, whatever you want to call it, is built out of 4 separate components. If we start at the top, we have the Studio application. This is where you produce the target map and you produce the source map. So this is a Windows application that is dedicated to describing how the migration transformations must function. It's a very structured interface. It allows you to be very precise and structured in the way you describe the mapping. It's a Windows application, so it's focused on being productive and being efficient and user-friendly. So each team member that is working with the studio to produce, for instance, a target map has his own Windows application installed locally and will be checking items in and out of a common repository. So you can collaborate across a team in an efficient manner because you are communicating via a common repository. These maps that you produce in Studio, they are so structured and so precise that they can be given to the engine, and the engine contains a code generator that will generate C# code that does exactly what is described in this map that we are generating the engine from. Whereas the Studio is meant to be used by users that do not necessarily have a deep technical or programming background. It's meant to be used by people that knows about the data and the business being moved across. So more like a functional consultant than a technical consultant. But when we get to the engine code, of course, this is more the technical people that will be working in this. If a common migration project will have some people that is concerned with kind of specifying what it is that needs to be done. In the normal situation, you will be using, for instance, Excel spreadsheets to kind of specify how you want the fields in the source system to be mapped to fields in the target system and how you want this to go on. Moving on. When you have a functioning engine, it can be deployed into the director. So now we are leaving the specification metadata world and we are entering into the operational world where we're actually executing the migration. So we get an engine from the code generator and that is deployed into the director. Director is also a Windows application, but it's like a client-server thing where you use this Windows application to remote control job processes that runs somewhere else. It can run locally on your own machine, but it can also run on a different machine in your network. So you can have a powerful migration server that is dedicated to that kind of thing. The director is also like one or two operators. Quite often it's the same people that will be doing the manual rule implementation that will do the operational stuff in the director. So again here, a smaller, more technical-minded audience. Once you have a quality, a state of your migration iterations that you think is presentable, makes sense, you then publish it to the tracker, which is the last application in our portfolio here. The tracker is a web application, and it is meant to be reaching out to the widest audience, namely, of course, the migration team itself, but also the business users that is involved in the project. And here we're talking real users from the business that is involved in the testing and verification of the migration results. So they can see whatever happened in the migration, they can see this in this tracker web application. It can also be management that want to have some idea of the quality and the progress of the migration that can have benefits of looking in the tracker application. So these are the 4 application components that makes out our framework. And my last slide before we actually go to C is how does it actually happen when these 4 migrations, 4 components are working together in a data migration project. So if you look up at the top, we have the Studio application that is used to produce the source map and the target map. And looking at the target map, you would basically start out by importing the metadata that describes what the target system expects. Now this can be anything. It can be the format of CSV files. It can be parameters to an API call. It can be a structure of a database table. It doesn't really matter. It's just the data that needs to be handed over to the target system at some point. And then working from that, you then expose an interface that you say, you have to give me these data, then I can map back, and from these data on the interface, I can figure out how to produce data that conforms to the target metadata. That's what you do in the target map. This target map produces the target interface that's imported into the source map. And much like the target metadata in the target map is standing there waving a flag and say, this is what we need, then the target interface in the source map stands in the source map and say, hey, you need to figure out how to deliver data to me that conforms to my specifications. In the source map, you import same type of metadata, but these metadata describes what you expect to receive from the source system. So these are the structures that you are out discovering in your landscape analysis that you were mentioning before. Where can I get data from? And what is the structure of the data? You need to import that into the source map. And using these metadata that describes what you will receive from the source or the legacy system, you then map how do you get from that to something that will flow through the target interface. This is what we do in the Studio application. It's all meta, it's all specification, it is all mapping, right? Once you're satisfied and it validates, you can then publish the mapping to the engine, and the engine generator will then generate a target engine and a source engine. And these 2 engines are deployed into the director runtime environment so they can execute. So now we are stepping from the green, which was metadata and mapping, down into the red, which is operational and executing data migration in the director. And at the start of things, the source engine will automatically maintain a set of staging tables in a database that corresponds to the source metadata. This happens automatically, so if during the lifetime of your project you import new source metadata into the source map, then the source engine will automatically update the staging database so it keeps it aligned with the source metadata. So the data is loaded. We receive data from the source system in some form, right? We expect to receive them as files, and we will load them into the staging database. We can load like CSV files, Excel files, XML files, whatever. And you can also extend this so you can load formats that we don't know about yet. or you can extend it so you can connect to a source database and pull the data. So there's many ways to get data into the staging database. One point here is that we prefer to load the data in as raw a form as possible. So a minimum of logic in the extraction of data from the source system, and let all that logic happen in the migration gives a better result and more traceability. Then when we have the data loaded in the staging database, we execute the source engine that will extract data from the staging database and perform the transformations necessary to produce the data that conforms to the interface. This is handed off to the target engine that in turn executes and performs all the mappings and transformations to get to the target data that conforms to the target metadata. And that's basically it. Then as a generic tool, we kind of got as far as we can go. And the last thing is, of course, there needs to be a delivery mechanism that actually then ends up delivering the data to the target system. But that exact delivery mechanism is very much dependent on which target system are we exactly talking about, because that can be done in so many different ways. So that's always going to be an extension point where you need to develop some kind of functionality to get from the data that we have to the data that can actually flow into the target system. Finally, when these engines execute, they will produce what we call events that is then published into the Tracker web application and visible to everybody in the Tracker. So these are all the components, 4 components at work, and how this happens.